Hey, Anna from NHCSR here. With the help of our nation's finest agricultural librarian and a team of chemical ecologists, I have been working my way through a very extensive review of the literature. We are getting very close to the finish line. I'm very excited. But I came across a paper that really stopped me in my tracks. I mean, I'm an entomologist. I have been working in this field for a very long time. I'm a little jaded. There's not a lot that can surprise me. I do a lot of weird shit, if you know what I mean. But this one made me stop and think, wow. Wow. I think it's a story worth sharing because you might start out thinking, what kind of monsters would do this? What kind of sicko scientists would blow time and money on this? But by the end of the story, you might be thinking, actually, that's kind of a genius move, and maybe we should try this in different systems. But stay tuned and you be the judge. This study investigates a novel control method for light brown apple moth. It's an invasive pest. Following public opposition to aerial pheromone spraying in California, developed something they called mobile mating disruption. This technique uses sterile medflies as living dispensers to carry and spread moth sex pheromone, disrupting the mating cycles of the target moth. And it worked. So I'm going to share the details of the paper, but there are several matters for you to understand in order to make your final conclusion. Sick waste of time and money or genius approach we should all be considering. Okay, here we go. So there's two different pest management techniques being combined here: mating disruption and sterile male technique or sterile insect technique. They're both pretty different, but they share a few things in common. First of all, we are seriously screwing with some males in all of these scenarios. In mating disruption, we are filling an orchard with so much synthetic female moth sex pheromone. The males cannot find the females, they cannot mate. Fewer mating events means fewer moth babies, less damage in the orchard. In the case of sterile male technique, we are literally mass rearing thousands and thousands of the pest insect. We are sterilizing them, usually with radiation, gamma rays, x-rays, and they're releasing them to go out into the world, find females this time, find females in the wild population, and shoot blanks, therefore driving down the population. This is real. This is a real thing that actually happens. So there's several success stories here, maybe only a handful compared to how many pests there are in the world. Part of that is because both of these methods are very species specific. So that's of benefit because it only impacts the pests and it really doesn't impact any other species of insects, non-target insects. But it also means that it's only worth the investment to develop these things and carry these things out unless there's a pest situation that either doesn't have a solution or is a pest situation that is so bad that it's an industry killer. For example, something that was in the news recently, it is very possible that there would be no cattle ranching in Texas if not for a sterile male technique eradication program. And it's very hard to imagine Texas without a cattle industry. So we have a mass rearing facility that gets fired up every time they find a screwworm in these regions. So there's several fly species that are pests of livestock. Normally they only get into the skin of livestock after some other damage. Screwworms are different. They actually will make a hole and cause all sorts of problems with cattle, sheep, any kind of mammal. So back in the 60s, they decided that this was such a threat to the cattle industry in Texas, they started a screwworm eradication program. And by 1966, they declared that the endemic population in Texas was eradicated. And they created this barrier zone where sterile fly releases were going to be maintained, basically along the border of Mexico, to prevent reinfestation. But just recently, February 2026, the USDA announced the completion of a new sterile fly dispersal facility at Moore Air Base in Texas, capable of dispersing 100 million flies per week to safeguard the Rio Grande Valley, which is a remarkable feat indeed. But again, imagine Texas without a cattle ranching industry. I think it's I think it's a good investment. Moving back into the paper. So anyone living in California in the 80s and 90s would be very familiar with medfly, or Mediterranean fruit fly. It's an invasive pest introduced from the Mediterranean. First reports in California were in 1975, but they started seeing serious outbreaks in the early 80s. And they were such a threat to California's $14 billion fruit industry that they instituted an area-wide eradication program that led to aerial spraying of malathion. This is a broad spectrum neurotoxin, and there are many twists and turns to this story, but you can imagine Southern California, fruit growing regions of California, there's a lot of public outcry. People were very unhappy about this, as they should be. So over time, that program did shift to a sterile male technique to suppress populations of medfly. They've kept it to a low boil since then. Since 1996, California has maintained a preventative release program. So they just continually release sterile males rather than waiting for outbreaks the way that they do with screwworm. Cute little detail is they do dye those flies a fluorescent pink or orange dye to indicate that that was a mass-reared fly. So if you're in California and you ever notice something that's fluorescing under a UV trap with a really bright one, that is brought to you from the USDA, and that is a sterile male. The medfly remains a Category A quarantine pest in the state of California, and California takes quarantining very seriously. I think anybody who's driven a car into the state of California and had to forfeit fresh fruits and vegetables at the border understands how seriously they take it. But medfly is not the only invasive pest they're dealing with in California. There's certainly other invasive pests they're concerned about. One pretty contentious invasive pest is light brown apple moth. It's native to Australia, first confirmed in California in 2006. So light brown apple moth is named apple moth, but it has a very wide host range, and it was a threat to all of the horticultural crops that were grown in California. So alarm bells were raised, and they classified this as a Class A pest, just the same as medfly. And as part of their eradication program, they started doing aerial applications of synthetic pheromone. So mating disruption. They were releasing synthetic sex pheromone for light brown apple moth in Monterey and Santa Cruz. So the goal was mating disruption, an area-wide approach that depresses the population. But these people remembered medfly, and they remembered that malathion, and they remembered the controversy. So they had a huge public outcry because of these aerial applications. Over 450 residents reported adverse health effects, including respiratory distress, skin irritation. Environmental groups blamed the spray for deaths of hundreds of seabirds at the time. All of this was not founded to be connected, but you could imagine. So after a lot of political pressure, they downgraded light brown apple moth from a Class A quarantine pest, and they've essentially said it's up to the orchardists to manage this pest. There's no quarantines for this pest in the state of California, and they just have to manage it like they would other pests, which means a lot of foliar applications of pesticides. There are mating disruption products that are available, but the amount of labor required to put those dispensers out, it's viewed as kind of a labor challenge. It's a barrier to adoption. It's just not as effective on a block by block basis. Part of that is because mated females that were mated by wild males out there that aren't being confused by the mating disruption, they can fly into blocks that are protected by mating disruption. So it's just something that works better on an area-wide basis. Now we're ready to turn to this paper, which is an uncharacteristically good read. They're having a lot of fun with this. And it really reminds me why I love being an entomologist and working with these brilliant people who say, like, why not? We have all the stuff, right? They use a lot of creative workarounds. They're working with a new formulation, one that it was not staying in formulation very well. It had this buoyancy to it. They needed to continually mix it. It says aqueous pheromone was maintained in suspension for the first application under constant mixing with a battery-powered mixing device made from a child's toy submarine propeller. they had it laying around. This work was actually done in Perth, Australia, but it was a collaboration between scientists from Australia, New Zealand, and USDA researchers in Hilo, Hawaii. So all these places is where they take quarantining and pest eradication very seriously. Much of this paper was fine-tuning what they called a menage a trois effect, or mobile mating disruption. Sterile male medflies were treated with microencapsulated light brown apple moth pheromone. These perfumed flies were then released, like a few thousand per hectare, in order to fly around and create these false trails that would confuse the light brown apple moth, in theory. So much of the data presented was fine-tuning how much moth pheromone they could apply to the flies without harming them. Eventually, they found that microencapsulating the pheromone improved things for the health of the fly, which has the added benefit of slowing the release of that pheromone from the fly body as they're flying around. And this is kind of darling. They did a lot at measuring how much pheromone was lost from the fly body from like grooming. So once they figured out the details of how much pheromone they can get on the flies, they found a bunch of release sites that they could study around urban Perth. These are in urban environments. They released about 1,000 flies per hectare, and they came back to monitor for the moth to see if this worked. So how do you know if mating disruption works? You put out traps with a point source of that pheromone, and if the moths are finding the point source of the pheromone and being trapped in the trap, that means the mating disruption is not working. If they can find it, we call this trap shutdown. So we see on this side of the chart, you have the untreated areas that they were catching lots of light brown apple moth in those traps. They were successfully finding point source of the pheromone in those traps. And on the other side, much fewer. So we are seeing signs of trap shutdown in the areas where they release the perfumed, sterilized medflies. Really cool. I cannot believe this worked. The study proves that using sterile insects as a pheromone carrier is technically feasible and socially acceptable. I mean, they make this argument in the paper that people didn't seem to care if they released these sterile flies in their backyards. The current payload of what this fly can carry around is pretty low compared to industrial dispensers, but the mobility of these flies allows them to reach moth populations in inaccessible areas, like these backyards. I think this is a genius move. This system was never adopted, mostly because of that quarantine downgrade of light brown apple moth. There was no reason to invest that money by the state of California. There was also some issues of money being siloed. But the concept of mobile mating disruption has certainly lived on in a few other ways. There's lots of research going on now looking at drones to release mating disruptions over broad areas. So they'll drop pheromone in like flakes, or splat like this waxy material. It achieves the same goal. You can cover a greater area. But what do you think? Are you convinced? Like, is this a genius thing, or is this just a bunch of sickos with God complexes? I'm kind of thinking about all of these rear and release biocontrol agents that we use in a lot of the systems I work with. Like, we're sending them out there to eat pest insects, but could we be putting them to work with like another side hustle of disrupting other pests in that agro-ecosystem? I'm thinking about this. Let me know what you think if you want to hear more stories like this. Thanks for listening.